I'm Emma Clarke, and the night I died, my parents asked the paramedics to let me go. I was 28 years old, lying on cold asphalt outside a restaurant in Boston's Beacon Hill, my body broken from a car that never saw me in the crosswalk. My vision blurred, sounds muffled like I was underwater. And through the chaos of sirens and shouting, I heard my mother's voice cutting through the noise with surgical precision. She wasn't screaming for help. She wasn't begging them to save me. She was calculating. My father stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, both of them watching the EMTs work on me with expressions I'd seen 1,000 times before. The same look they'd given when I'd chosen marketing over law school, when I'd moved to a modest apartment instead of their guest house, when I'd brought Jake to Sunday dinner in his worn sweater instead of a Brooks Brothers suit. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The lead paramedic, a man with kind eyes and graying temples, was checking my vitals when my mother leaned in close enough for me to catch her words despite my fading consciousness. "Is there any chance she won't make it?" she asked, her tone exactly like when she'd asked the sommelier about wine pairings at their country club. The paramedic looked up, confusion crossing his face, and my father cleared his throat in that way he did before delivering bad news to investors. "We need to be realistic about quality of life," he said, his voice steady and rational. "If the prognosis isn't favorable, we don't want her to suffer. She's always been fragile." I felt hands on my chest, pressure, counted compressions, and somewhere in that moment between consciousness and darkness, I understood with absolute clarity that my parents were hoping I wouldn't survive the night. Not because they loved me too much to see me suffer, but because a dead daughter was easier to explain at the country club than a recovering one who might need their time, their money, their attention during the social season. The paramedic named David, I'd learn later, ignored them completely and worked faster. But I heard everything. I remembered everything. And when I woke up 3 days later in Massachusetts General Hospital with a shattered pelvis, broken ribs, and a punctured lung, I knew exactly what I had to do. Growing up as the youngest Clarke came with expectations I could never quite meet. My brother Mason was everything my parents wanted: Harvard Law, a position at one of Boston's most prestigious firms, a wife whose Instagram followers numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and a daughter they could parade at charity functions. I was the afterthought, the daughter who'd arrived 7 years after they'd stopped trying, the child whose baby photos appeared last in the family albums, slightly out of focus, cropped at awkward angles. My parents never said I was unwanted, but Victoria Clarke had a way of communicating disappointment without words. She'd introduce Mason as my son the attorney, then gesture vaguely in my direction with an Emma. My father Richard was more direct in his dismissal. He'd built his career at Whitmore Investment Group through calculated decisions and strategic relationships, and he'd assessed me early on as a poor investment. When I'd shown aptitude for art and design instead of economics, when I'd struggled with the social performances that came naturally to Mason, when I'd chosen Boston University over applying to Harvard, each choice had been another mark in his mental ledger proving I wasn't worth the effort. They'd paid for my education because that's what people in their circle did, but the checks came with sighs and comments about wasted potential. After graduation, I'd started my own marketing consultancy, working with small businesses and local nonprofits. It wasn't glamorous, but I was building something mine, something that didn't require me to network at yacht clubs or laugh at jokes I didn't find funny. I'd found an apartment in Back Bay. Nothing like the sprawling Beacon Hill brownstone where I'd grown up, but it had good light and enough space for my desk and drafting table. My parents visited once, Victoria's eyes sweeping over my thrift store furniture and modest kitchen with barely concealed horror. "This is very bohemian," she'd said, which in her vocabulary meant failure. Mason had been more subtle in his judgment. He'd stopped by with Vanessa and Lily a few months after I'd moved in, and while my niece had been excited to see my art supplies and the little balcony overlooking the street, Mason had spent the visit checking his phone and making comments about property values in better neighborhoods. Vanessa had taken photos of Lily on my balcony, but carefully angled the shots to avoid showing my building's modest facade. She'd posted them later with a caption about authentic city living, never mentioning they were at her sister-in-law's place. I'd learned to expect this kind of treatment, but it still stung every time. The Sunday dinners at my parents' house were mandatory performances. Victoria would seat us in the formal dining room, Mason and Vanessa on either side of her and Richard at the heads of the table, me and Jake squeezed in at one end near the kitchen door. The conversations always centered on Mason's cases, Vanessa's brand partnerships, Lily's private school achievements. When I'd mention a new client or a successful campaign, Victoria would nod politely and immediately pivot to asking Mason about his latest courtroom victory. Richard would use these dinners to hold court, discussing market trends and investment strategies with Mason while Jake and I sat largely silent. Jake, to his credit, had tried to engage at first. He'd ask questions about their charitable work, compliment the food, attempt to find common ground. But after the dinner where Richard had asked what Jake did, and responded to physical therapists with a dismissive well, someone has to do it, Jake had stopped trying so hard. We'd started making excuses to skip dinners, claiming work conflicts or prior commitments. But Victoria had a way of making absence worse than attendance. She'd called to inform me that Mason had brought important colleagues to Sunday dinner, and it looked strange that his sister couldn't be bothered to appear. The guilt worked every time. 3 months before the accident, I'd made one last genuine effort to connect with my family. It was Lily's 7th birthday, and I'd spent weeks creating a custom illustrated storybook for her. A tale about a brave girl who built a magical garden. I'd hand-drawn every page, bound it myself, even included small watercolor details. Lily had loved it, hugging me and asking me to read it to her immediately. But Vanessa had barely glanced at it before setting it aside to show Lily the designer dress Mason had bought her. Victoria had picked up the book later, flipped through it quickly, and said it's very crafty before moving on to admire the expensive gifts from their country club friends. Mason hadn't even acknowledged it. That night, I'd seen Vanessa's Instagram story showing all of Lily's presents laid out on their marble coffee table. My book wasn't in the shot. When I'd visited their house a week later, I'd found it in Lily's room, shoved on a high shelf behind store-bought books, the spine already creased like it had been handled roughly. Lily had asked me to read it to her that day, and I had, but I'd noticed Vanessa rolling her eyes to Mason in the hallway. After that, I'd stopped trying to prove myself to them. I'd focused on my business, my relationship with Jake, building a life that didn't require their approval. Jake had been my anchor through all of it. We'd met at a gym in Back Bay 2 years ago, both of us terrible at spinning class and laughing about it afterward over coffee. He was genuine in a way my family never had been, interested in my work because he actually cared, not because it might benefit him socially. He'd grown up in a working-class family in Dorchester, put himself through school, built his physical therapy practice through actual skill rather than connections. My parents had been coldly polite to him at best. Victoria once asked him if he'd considered pursuing a medical degree instead of therapy, her tone suggesting she couldn't quite understand why anyone would stop at such a modest achievement. Richard had simply never engaged with him beyond perfunctory greetings. The night of the accident, Jake and I had been leaving a small Italian restaurant in Beacon Hill after celebrating a major client signing I'd landed. It wasn't fancy by my parents' standards, just a neighborhood spot with good pasta and reasonable prices, but it felt like ours. We'd been walking back to where I'd parked my Honda Civic, laughing about something silly, when I'd stepped into the crosswalk at the intersection of Charles and Mount Vernon. I'd looked both ways, seen the walk signal, felt Jake's hand in mine. Then there was the screech of tires, Jake yanking me backward but not fast enough, the impact that sent me flying, and the world tilting sideways as I hit the pavement. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, radiating from my hip and ribs, each breath feeling like knives. I could hear Jake shouting my name, his voice high with panic, and then other voices, people running, someone calling 911. My vision kept blurring and clearing, and I couldn't move my legs. I'd never felt fear like that, the absolute terror of my body not responding to my commands. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The sirens came fast, or maybe time had stopped, I couldn't tell. I remember the paramedics arriving, their professional calm as they assessed me, the rattle of equipment, the smell of antiseptic and exhaust fumes. Jake was somewhere above me, his face pale, holding my hand until someone gently moved him back to give the EMTs room to work. That's when my parents arrived. I hadn't even known they were nearby, but later I'd learned they'd been leaving dinner at their country club just 2 blocks away when they'd seen the commotion. Victoria had been wearing her pearls and a cocktail dress, Richard in his blazer, both of them looking like they'd stepped out of a society magazine. They'd pushed through the small crowd that had gathered, and I'd felt a moment of relief through the pain. My parents were here. They'd take care of things. They'd make sure I was okay. But Victoria's face when she saw me wasn't relief or fear or even concern. It was calculation, the same expression she wore when managing a social crisis, like when a fellow board member had been caught in a scandal, and she'd had to decide whether to publicly support or quietly distance. She'd looked at the paramedics working on me, at the growing crowd, at Richard, and I'd seen her mental gears turning. The lead paramedic, David, had been talking to me, trying to keep me conscious, telling me I was doing great, that they were going to take care of me. His partner was setting up in 4-line, and I could feel them preparing to move me onto a backboard. That's when my mother had stepped closer and asked her question. Is there any chance she won't make it? The words hung in the air, and even through my haze of pain, I'd felt them land like stones. David had looked up at her, his hands still on my chest, and for a second I'd seen confusion cross his face, like he'd misheard. I'm sorry, he'd said, still professional but with an edge. We're doing everything we can. She's stable right now. My father had moved beside my mother then, and I'd watched him assess the situation with the same cold efficiency he brought to board meetings. We understand you're doing your job, he'd said, his voice measured. But we need to think about Emma's quality of life here. If there's significant damage, if recovery would be prolonged or uncertain, we want to know all the options. We don't want her to suffer unnecessarily. She's always had a fragile constitution. David's partner, a younger woman with dark hair pulled back tight, had stopped what she was doing and stared at them. Your daughter has multiple fractures and internal injuries, she'd said, her tone sharp. We're taking her to Mass General now. You can discuss long-term care with doctors there. But Victoria hadn't backed down. We're simply trying to understand the severity, she'd said, smoothing her dress. We have obligations tonight, commitments, and we need to know if we should cancel or if this is something that can be managed. I'd wanted to scream, to tell them I could hear every word, but my voice wouldn't work, my breath too shallow, my body shutting down. Jake had been the one to explode. What the hell is wrong with you? He'd shouted, his voice cracking. She's your daughter. She needs you right now, not your cost-benefit analysis. Richard had turned to him with that withering look he reserved for people he considered beneath notice. This is a family matter, he'd said coldly. Perhaps you should wait at the hospital. We'll handle this. But David had already made his decision. He'd signaled to his partner, and they'd lifted me onto the gurney with efficient speed, moving toward the ambulance. Jake had tried to follow, but they'd told him he couldn't ride with me, that he'd need to meet us there. The last thing I'd seen before they'd loaded me in was my mother's face, composed and calculating, and my father checking his watch like this was an inconvenient interruption to his evening plans. In the ambulance, as David and his partner worked on me, I'd heard them talking in low voices. Did you hear what they said? The younger paramedic had asked. David's response was quiet but firm. I heard it. And I'm documenting every word. Emma had faded in and out during the ride, the pain medication they'd given me pulling me under, but I'd held on to one thought with absolute clarity. My parents had wanted me to die. Not because they loved me too much to see me suffer, but because my survival was inconvenient. A dead daughter was a tragedy they could manage, a moment of sympathy at the country club, a scholarship in my name through their foundation, a living daughter who needed months of recovery, who might need their help, their time, their money during their busy social calendar. That was unacceptable. When I'd finally woken up 3 days later in a hospital room at Mass General, tubes and wires connecting me to machines, my first coherent thought wasn't about my injuries. It was about what I was going to do with what I knew. Jake had been asleep in the chair beside my bed, his hand resting near mine, and when I'd made a sound, he jerked awake immediately. Emma, he'd breathed, his eyes filling. Thank God. You're awake. He'd called for the doctor, and within minutes my room had filled with medical staff. Dr. Sarah Chun, my attending physician, had been professional but warm, explaining my injuries with a thoroughness I appreciated. Fractured pelvis, 3 broken ribs, punctured lung that they'd repaired, severe bruising and lacerations. I'd need surgery to place pins in my pelvis, extensive physical therapy, months of recovery. But I was alive. And with time and work, I'd heal completely. She'd asked if I wanted to see my family, and I'd felt my chest tighten. "Are they here?" I'd asked. Jake had exchanged a look with Dr. Chen. "Your parents visited once," he'd said carefully. "When you were still unconscious. They stayed about 20 minutes, then said they'd check back later. That was 2 days ago. Your brother came by yesterday morning for about 10 minutes. My mother had stayed 20 minutes while I was unconscious and hadn't returned. My father hadn't even bothered to pretend longer than that. Mason had given me 10 minutes of his valuable time." The clarity I'd felt in the ambulance returned, sharp and cold. I'd looked at Dr. Chen and asked if there was any way to get a copy of the paramedic report from the accident. She'd seemed surprised by the question, but had said she could request it for my records. "Is there a specific reason you need it?" she'd asked gently. I'd met her eyes. "I want to know exactly what happened. Every detail." She'd nodded slowly, and I'd seen understanding dawn in her expression. She'd been an emergency physician long enough to recognize when something wasn't right. "I'll get you everything," she'd said quietly. Jake had waited until we were alone to ask what I was thinking. I told him about waking up in the ambulance, about hearing David document my parents' words, about the cold calculation in their voices. His face had gone pale, then red with anger. "We need to do something," he'd said. "We need to tell someone." But who would believe us against Richard and Victoria Clarke, pillars of Boston society, generous donors to half the city's cultural institutions? My word against theirs, with me on pain medication and recovering from trauma. They'd spin it as a misunderstanding, as grief and stress. And their lawyers would bury any accusation under mountains of reasonable doubt. "No," I told Jake. "We're going to be smarter than that. We're going to let them think everything is fine. And then we're going to make sure everyone knows exactly who they really are." The surgery happened on my 5th day in the hospital. Dr. Chen explained the procedure with methodical patience, showing me x-rays of my pelvis, and where they'd need to insert surgical pins to stabilize the fractures. The breaks were clean enough that I'd recover fully with proper rehabilitation. She assured me, though the timeline stretched ahead like a marathon I hadn't trained for. 6 to 8 weeks before I could put weight on my left side. Another 3 months of intensive physical therapy after that, possibly longer depending on how my body responded. Jake held my hand through the pre-op preparations, his thumb tracing circles on my palm while nurses checked vitals and anesthesiologists went through their protocols. I'd asked him to do something for me while I was under. Something that had been burning in my mind since I'd woken up. I needed him to find David Walsh, the lead paramedic from the accident, and get his contact information. Jake had understood immediately, no questions about why or what I planned, just a firm nod and a promise that he'd take care of it. When I emerged from anesthesia hours later, groggy and nauseated, the first thing I saw was Jake's face hovering above me. He'd stayed the entire time, waiting through surgery, and now he leaned close enough for me to hear him whisper that he'd found David. The paramedic worked out of Station 12 in Cambridge, Jake said, and he'd left his personal number with the message that he wanted to talk to me when I was ready. Something in Jake's expression told me David had been expecting the call, that whatever he'd witnessed that night had been weighing on him too. The pain medication pulled me back under before I could respond, but I slept better knowing that peace was in place. My parents visited on the 7th day, nearly a week after the accident. I'd been moved from intensive care to a regular recovery room, and the nurses had gotten me sitting up in bed despite the screaming protest of my ribs. I was picking at bland hospital eggs when Victoria and Richard appeared in the doorway, both dressed like they were attending a business lunch rather than visiting their hospitalized daughter. Victoria wore a cream cashmere sweater set with tailored slacks, her signature pearls at her throat. Richard had on one of his custom suits, probably Brioni, with a silk tie that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. They didn't rush to my bedside or show any visible relief that I was conscious and coherent. Instead, they stood just inside the door, maintaining a careful distance. and I realized with a jolt that they looked disappointed to find me awake and alert. The recording of my father's conversation became the cornerstone of everything that followed. I'd listened to it dozens of times, each playback sharpening my resolve and adding layers to my understanding of just how calculated their cruelty truly was. Richard Clarke wasn't just a neglectful father. He was actively exploiting my tragedy for financial benefit, using charitable resources meant for desperately ill children to offset the inconvenience of my recovery expenses. The elegance of his scheme was almost impressive in its audacity, routing costs through foundation programs designed to assist families with medical bills. Except the family he was assisting was his own. Lisa had immediately recognized the legal implications and started building a comprehensive timeline of foundation expenditures, looking for other instances where personal expenses might have been disguised as charitable activities. What she'd uncovered over the following weeks painted a damning picture that extended far beyond my immediate situation. Jake had taken a different approach to gathering evidence, focusing on the social dimension of my parents' world. He'd started attending events where they were likely to appear, charity auctions and gallery openings listed in the society pages, positioning himself as just another face in the crowd while observing how Richard and Victoria performed their roles. He'd watched my mother work a room at a pediatric cancer fundraiser, her practice compassion deployed strategically on major donors while dismissing volunteers and lower-level contributors with barely concealed impatience. He'd seen my father glad-hand corporate executives at a museum gala, promising access and influence with the smooth confidence of someone who'd turned relationship building into a profitable art form. Jake had even managed to strike up conversations with people in their orbit, other board members and social acquaintances, carefully asking questions that revealed how the Clarks were perceived in their elite circles. The consensus had been consistent: they were admired for their generosity and envied for their status, but nobody seemed to actually like them on a personal level. Respect without affection. Influence without genuine connection. The most valuable intelligence had come from a former employee of the Clarke Foundation, a woman named Teresa Morales who'd worked as program coordinator for 3 years before being abruptly terminated. Lisa had tracked her down through professional networking sites, and Teresa had agreed to meet at a coffee shop in Cambridge, far enough from Beacon Hill to feel safe from accidental encounters with my parents. She'd been cautious initially, clearly scarred by her experience, and wary of saying anything that might violate her non-disclosure agreement. But when Lisa had explained that we were investigating potential misuse of charitable funds, Teresa's reserve had crumbled. What she'd described over 2 hours of careful conversation had been worse than I'd imagined. The foundation, she'd said, existed primarily as a vehicle for Victoria Clarke's social ambitions and Richard Clarke's business networking. The actual charitable work was minimal and often performative, designed to generate maximum publicity with minimum expenditure. Teresa had given specific examples that made my stomach turn. There'd been a proposal to fund a medical equipment donation to a struggling community health center in Dorchester, a straightforward project that would have cost $40,000 and helped hundreds of families access basic diagnostic tools. Victoria had rejected it because the center wasn't in a prestigious enough location and wouldn't attract the kind of donors she wanted to cultivate. Instead, that same money had gone toward hosting a private dinner for major contributors at an exclusive restaurant. A single evening of expensive food and wine that produced elegant photos for the foundation's annual report, but zero actual medical assistance. When Teresa had questioned this allocation during a board meeting, suggesting that perhaps the mission should take priority over donor entertainment, Victoria had accused her of not understanding the realities of fundraising. Within a month, Teresa had been let go for performance issues that had never been documented before she'd raised concerns. The non-disclosure agreement Teresa had signed prevented her from speaking publicly about internal foundation operations, but she'd kept her own records, detailed notes about questionable decisions and copies of budget documents that showed the disturbing pattern of expense allocation. She'd held onto them for 3 years, she'd admitted, hoping someone would eventually investigate, because what she'd witnessed had bothered her deeply. Children's faces had appeared in every foundation brochure and promotional video. Sick kids whose stories were used to tug heartstrings and open wallets, but the actual money raised rarely reached those children or programs that would help them. Teresa had offered to share her documentation with Lisa, understanding that it might violate her NDA, but willing to take that risk if it meant exposing what she called a fundamentally dishonest operation. I'd promised her that we'd protect her identity as much as possible, but she'd shaken her head with a bitter smile. If this goes public, they'll know it was me, she'd said. I'm the only program coordinator they've fired who might have kept records. But honestly, I'll feel better knowing I finally did something about it. Dr. Chun had continued to be an invaluable ally, though her involvement had to remain carefully professional given her position at Massachusetts General. She'd connected me with other medical professionals who'd had interactions with my parents through the foundation, doctors and nurses who'd been approached about participating in publicity events or lending their credentials to foundation materials. Several had expressed discomfort with how the Clarkes operated, noting that requests for their involvement always emphasized photo opportunities and public recognition, rather than substantive collaboration on medical programs. One pediatric oncologist had described being invited to speak at a foundation gala, only to discover that his carefully prepared presentation about childhood cancer treatment needs had been cut to 5 minutes, so more time could be devoted to an auction of luxury vacation packages. Another had served briefly on the foundation's medical advisory board before resigning when it became clear the board was purely decorative, consulted for credibility, but never actually involved in decision-making about fund allocation. Dr. Chun had also facilitated my meeting with David Walsh on hospital grounds, arranging a conference room where we could talk privately without raising questions about why a paramedic and former patient were meeting. David had brought his complete incident report from the night of my accident, along with his partner's corroborating notes and the timeline of events logged by dispatch. Reading through the clinical documentation of that night had been surreal, seeing my trauma reduced to medical terminology and timestamps. But it had also been validating in a way I hadn't expected. Every detail I remembered was confirmed: the time my parents had arrived, the duration of their presence at the scene, the specific questions they'd asked about withholding treatment. David's narrative notes had been particularly detailed, describing my parents' emotional presentation as notably flat affect and lacking typical parental distress, noting that both parties appeared more concerned with logistical considerations than patient welfare. His partner had written similar observations, adding that the mother had asked multiple times about timeline for transport and whether patient would regain consciousness before hospital arrival, questions that had seemed focused on avoiding interaction rather than seeking reassurance. David had also told me something that wasn't in the official report, a detail he'd shared with his supervisor but hadn't documented because it fell into the category of impression rather than observable fact. After they'd loaded me into the ambulance and pulled away from the scene, he'd glanced back through the rear window and seen my parents already walking away, not toward their own vehicle to follow us to the hospital, but in the opposite direction, back toward wherever they'd been going when they'd been interrupted by my accident. They hadn't come to the hospital that night at all, David had confirmed. He'd checked because he'd wanted to update family on my status, and the emergency department had no record of Richard or Victoria Clarke inquiring about their daughter. They'd simply left the scene and returned to their evening, confident that I was being handled, that the inconvenience had been managed. The casual cruelty of that abandonment had hit me harder than almost anything else, the image of them walking away while I fought for consciousness in the back of an ambulance. Jake had been furious when I'd told him about David's observation, his hands clenching into fists, his face flushed with an anger I rarely saw from him. "How do you just walk away from your kid like that?" he'd said, his voice raw. "How do you not camp out in that emergency room until you know she's going to be okay?" I hadn't had an answer because I'd stopped trying to understand my parents' capacity for detachment years ago. Some people simply weren't wired for genuine emotional connection, and Richard and Victoria Clarke were prime examples. They'd learned to perform concern when socially necessary, but when there was no audience that mattered, when the only witness was a paramedic whose opinion didn't affect their social standing, the performance dropped and their true indifference showed through. Jake had pulled me close then, careful of my still healing ribs, and held me while I cried for the parents I'd never had and finally accepted I never would have. The physical therapy had progressed to the point where I could walk short distances without the walker, graduating to a cane for stability, and Michelle had been impressed with my determination and progress. "You're healing faster than most patients with your injury profile," she'd said during one session. "Whatever's motivating you, keep channeling it." She'd had no idea that my motivation was the systematic destruction of my parents' carefully constructed world. That every painful step and grueling exercise was building not just physical strength, but the foundation for their downfall. I'd started venturing out of the guest house more, making short trips to the main house under the pretense of family dinners that Victoria had insisted on resuming now that I was more mobile. These dinners were awkward performances where we'd sit in the formal dining room, making stilted conversation while staff served courses that none of us seemed to actually enjoy. Richard would discuss market trends and political developments. Victoria would report on foundation activities and social engagements. Mason, when he bothered to attend, would contribute legal anecdotes or updates on his cases. And I would sit there, playing the role of grateful recovering daughter, while mentally cataloging every detail I observed. What I'd noticed during these dinners had been revealing in small but significant ways. The house staff, a housekeeper named Carmen and a part-time chef named Marcus, treated my parents with professional courtesy, but none of the warmth I'd seen them show toward Mason, or even toward me during my childhood. They performed their duties efficiently, but without the small gestures of genuine care that people show when they respect their employers as human beings. Carmen never lingered to chat the way she once had when I was younger. Marcus prepared elaborate meals with technical skill but no passion, the food beautiful and flavorless. When I'd managed to catch Carmen alone in the kitchen one evening, asking casually about how she'd been polite but guarded until I'd mentioned that I was recovering well despite everything. Her expression had shifted slightly, and she'd said quietly that she'd been very worried when she'd heard about my accident, that she'd asked Mrs. Clarke several times about my condition in those first days, but had been told not to concern herself with family matters. The dismissal in Victoria's response had apparently extended to her own staff, people who'd worked in the house for years, and might have wanted to know if someone they'd watched grow up was going to be okay. Lisa's investigation had expanded to include the foundation's vendor relationships, examining the companies contracted for event planning, catering, printing, and other services. What she'd discovered was a network of overpriced contracts awarded to businesses owned by friends and social connections of my parents, creating a circular flow of money that benefited their entire social circle, while minimizing actual charitable spending. One event planner charged 3 times the market rate for foundation galas, producing events that were undeniably elegant, but absurdly expensive relative to their fundraising purpose. A printing company owned by one of Richard's golf partners produced the foundation's promotional materials at premium rates, despite the fact that identical work could be obtained elsewhere for a fraction of the cost. The foundation's legal counsel, Mason's own firm, billed at partner rates for routine corporate maintenance work that could have been handled by a junior associate. Every aspect of the foundation's operations seemed designed to channel money through an ecosystem of elite service providers, creating value for everyone except the supposed beneficiaries. The documentation Lisa had assembled was devastating in its cumulative impact. Individual instances might be explainable as judgment calls or necessary expenses, but the pattern was undeniable when viewed as a whole. The Clarke Foundation raised an average of $600,000 annually through its gala and various donation campaigns. Of that amount, roughly $180,000 went to actual program expenses, medical equipment donations, treatment assistance, and support services for families. The remaining $420,000 covered administrative costs, event expenses, consulting fees, and various other categories that primarily benefited the foundation's operation rather than its mission. The ratio was appalling even by nonprofit standards, where overhead questions were always scrutinized. But what made it potentially criminal was the evidence that Richard and Victoria were personally benefiting, routing their own expenses through foundation accounts, and using charitable resources for private purposes disguised as program costs. Teresa's documentation included email exchanges where Victoria had directed foundation staff to process personal expenses as charitable activities, a car service to a society wedding billed as transportation for a foundation board meeting, catering for a family birthday party charged to a donor appreciation event that didn't appear on any public calendar. Richard had been more sophisticated in his approach, structuring things through his role at Whitmore Investment where he could blur the lines between corporate sponsorship and personal benefit, but the effect was the same. Foundation money flowing back to the Clarke family in ways that violated both the spirit and likely the letter of charitable organization regulations. Lisa had consulted with a nonprofit attorney who'd reviewed the documentation and confirmed that if these patterns could be proven, the Clarkes could face serious legal consequences, potential criminal charges for fraud and misuse of charitable funds, civil penalties, and mandatory dissolution of the foundation. Jake had wanted to go to authorities immediately with what we'd gathered, but Lisa had counseled patience. "We need this airtight," she'd insisted. "Your parents have resources and connections. They'll mount an aggressive defense, attack our credibility, claim any irregularities were innocent mistakes or accounting errors. We need enough evidence that the pattern is irrefutable, and we need to go public in a way that makes it impossible for them to bury it quietly." She'd been working on a comprehensive investigative piece for her news site, a detailed exposé that would lay out the foundation's practices, my parents' personal behavior at my accident scene, and the broader pattern of using charitable work as a vehicle for social climbing and personal enrichment. But she'd wanted to time publication strategically, hitting when it would generate maximum impact and attention. The foundation's annual gala was scheduled for mid-December, the biggest event of their social calendar, where the Clarkes would be celebrating another successful year of fundraising while Boston's elite gathered to see and be seen. Lisa's idea had been simple and devastating: publish the exposé the morning of the gala, ensuring that every attendee arrived knowing exactly what they were supporting. The plan had crystallized over several strategy sessions in my guest house apartment, Jake and Lisa and I mapping out the sequence of events and anticipating potential responses. We'd need to coordinate carefully, Lisa publishing her piece with all documentation available for public review, me prepared to speak on record about my parents' behavior at the accident scene, and my recovery period. David Walsh and Dr. Chen ready to provide professional corroboration of the medical aspects. Teresa Morales had agreed to go public with her experience as former foundation employee, accepting that she'd likely face legal action from my parents, but willing to testify if needed. We'd also contact the Massachusetts Attorney General's office simultaneously with publication, providing them with all financial documentation and formal complaints about charitable fraud. The multi-pronged approach would make it impossible for my parents to contain the damage, no single point of failure, no way to quietly settle or intimidate people into silence. But I'd insisted on one additional element that Lisa and Jake had initially resisted. I wanted to confront my parents directly before the story broke, not to give them warning or opportunity to prepare, but because I needed to see their faces when they realized what was coming. I needed them to know that I'd heard every word they'd said that night, that I'd spent months methodically gathering evidence of their corruption, that the daughter they'd dismissed as weak and forgettable was about to destroy everything they valued. Lisa had worried that confrontation might tip them off, give them time to move assets or destroy evidence, but I'd argued that by the time I confronted them, everything would already be in motion, the story filed and ready to publish, authorities already contacted and reviewing documentation. The confrontation would be theater, deeply personal theater, but it wouldn't change the outcome. Jake had understood why I needed this. Why after years of being diminished and dismissed I needed one moment where they had to see me as the architect of their downfall. The date had been set for December 10th, 4 days before the gala. Lisa would publish her exposé online at 8 in the morning, time to catch the news cycle, and start spreading before my parents were even awake. By noon, every major media outlet in Boston would be covering it, and by evening, the story would have national attention given the dramatic elements of parents asking EMTs to let their daughter die combined with systematic charitable fraud. The gala itself would likely be cancelled once sponsors started pulling out, but if somehow my parents tried to proceed, they'd be walking into a room full of people who knew exactly what they'd done. The social destruction would be absolute, decades of carefully cultivated reputation obliterated in a single news cycle. But before any of that happened, I'd have my confrontation. I'd sit across from Richard and Victoria Clarke and watch their world end. The weeks leading up to execution day had been strange, knowing the exact date when everything would change, living in their guest house and attending their dinners while carrying the secret of their imminent exposure. I'd had to maintain my performance as the grateful daughter, even as every interaction reinforced my resolve. Victoria had hosted a small dinner party at the main house where she'd invited several board members from the foundation, and I'd been expected to attend as proof of the family's resilience and unity. I'd sat in my childhood dining room, listening to my mother hold forth about the foundation's impact and the importance of their annual gala, watching wealthy people congratulate each other on their generosity, while completely unaware that their charitable contributions were funding an elaborate social operation with minimal actual benefit to anyone in need. One board member, a woman named Judith Pemberton who owned a gallery on Newberry Street, had asked me about my recovery and expressed admiration for how well I was doing given such a traumatic experience. If only she knew what trauma actually meant in the Clarke household. Mason had visited twice during this period, brief stops where he'd checked on my physical progress with clinical interest but no emotional investment. During his second visit, he'd mentioned casually that the foundation's legal work had been particularly profitable for his firm lately, that they'd been expanding their nonprofit practice area thanks to the relationship with our parents. The lack of self-awareness had been stunning, my brother completely oblivious to the fact that he was directly benefiting from the questionable practices Lisa had documented, that his own billing records would likely be part of the evidence trail. I'd asked him pointed questions about the legal review process for charitable expenditures, whether someone at his firm verified that foundation spending aligned with its stated mission, and he'd waved off the concern. Our parents run a tight ship, he'd said. I'm not worried about compliance issues. His confidence would make the fall that much harder. Lily had been the only genuinely difficult part of the plan. She'd continued to FaceTime me regularly, her 7-year-old enthusiasm and affection undiminished by her parents' indifference to my situation. She'd drawn me pictures and held them up to the camera, created stories about princesses and dragons that she'd perform with elaborate gestures, asked when I could come play at her house again. Every interaction reminded me that she was an innocent in all of this, that the exposure of her grandparents would inevitably impact her, that Mason and Vanessa would face their own consequences that would ripple into Lily's young life. I'd struggled with guilt about this until Jake had reminded me that protecting Lily meant allowing her to grow up thinking corruption and cruelty were acceptable as long as you maintained appearances. Better she learn young that actions have consequences, he'd said, that integrity matters more than status. It hadn't completely eased my guilt, but it had helped me maintain resolve. Dr. Chun had scheduled a final follow-up appointment 3 days before publication, a last assessment of my recovery progress before I'd transitioned to standard outpatient care. She'd been pleased with my physical healing, the bones knitting properly, my mobility restored beyond what she'd initially projected. But she'd also looked at me with concern that went beyond medical assessment. Emma, you're carrying a lot of tension, she'd said. I can see it in how you hold yourself, the tightness in your shoulders and jaw. Whatever's coming, whatever you're planning, make sure you have support in place for the aftermath. Recovery isn't just physical. I'd thanked her for everything she'd done, both the medical care and the documentation she'd provided, and I'd promised I'd take care of myself. She'd given me her personal number and told me to call if I needed anything, professional or personal, and I'd realized that in this whole terrible situation, I'd found people who cared about me more genuinely than my blood family ever had. David Walsh with his integrity, Lisa Rodriguez with her investigative tenacity, Jake Morrison with his steadfast support, Dr. Sarah Chun with her clinical skill and human compassion. They were my real family now. The night before everything went into motion, Jake had stayed late at the guest house, and we'd talked through every step one final time. Lisa's article was written and fact-checked, scheduled to publish automatically at 8 a.m. The Attorney General's office had been briefed, and was prepared to open a formal investigation the moment the story broke. David Walsh and Dr. Chun were both on standby to speak with media if contacted. Teresa Morales had recorded a video statement detailing her experience at the foundation, ready to release if my parents tried to deny any allegations. Every piece was in position. Jake had held my face in his hands, and asked one more time if I was certain about confronting my parents directly. I'd told him I'd never been more certain of anything. This wasn't just about exposing their corruption, it was about reclaiming my voice, showing them and showing myself that I wasn't the weak, dismissible person they'd always treated me as. I was the person who'd survived what they'd wanted to let kill me, who'd turned that survival into systematic documentation of their every failing, who was about to hold them accountable in ways they'd never imagined possible. We'd sat together in the quiet of the guest house, and I'd felt a strange peace despite the magnitude of what was coming. Tomorrow morning, the world would know what Richard and Victoria Clarke really were beneath their polished facade. Their charitable foundation would be investigated and likely shut down. Their social standing would evaporate as friends and associates scrambled to distance themselves. Mason would face professional consequences as his firm's relationship with the foundation came under scrutiny. And I would finally be free of the weight of their dismissal, their cruelty, their fundamental inability to see me as worthy of basic human care. Jake had asked what I wanted to do after everything went public, where I saw myself in 6 months or a year. I'd thought about the question carefully before answering. I wanted to rebuild my consulting business with the energy I'd been devoting to gathering evidence. I wanted to move forward with Jake into whatever our relationship would become without the shadow of my parents' judgment. And I wanted to find ways to support actual charitable work, the kind that helped people rather than feeding someone's social ambitions. Maybe work with Teresa to create something better, a legitimate organization that served the vulnerable families the Clarke Foundation had used as props. Turn this whole terrible experience into something genuinely meaningful. The alarm had gone off at 6 a.m. on December 10th, and I'd woken with absolute clarity of purpose. Lisa's article would publish in 2 hours. At 9, I'd call my parents and request a family meeting at the main house. By 10, I'd be sitting across from them watching their world collapse. Jake had offered to come with me, but I'd declined. This confrontation needed to be just family, just me and the people who'd failed me so profoundly, so they couldn't hide behind the presence of outsiders or claim I was being dramatic for an audience. I'd dressed carefully in real clothes for the first time in weeks, not the comfortable recovery where I'd been living in, but tailored pants and a silk blouse that made me look professional and put together. I'd wanted them to see that I wasn't the broken victim they'd left on that asphalt. I was someone who'd rebuilt herself specifically to tear them down. At 8 precisely, Lisa had texted me a link to the published article. The headline had been everything we'd hoped for: Clarke Foundation investigation. Prominent Boston couple accused of charitable fraud after asking EMTs to let daughter die. The story was comprehensive and devastating, opening with David Walsh's account of the accident scene, before diving into the foundation's financial practices and Teresa's testimony about internal operations. Every allegation was meticulously sourced, every claim backed by documentation. Lisa had even included audio from the recording I'd made of my father discussing using foundation funds for my recovery expenses, the damning conversation that proved intent rather than mere negligence. Reading through the article, seeing years of private suffering and months of investigation transformed into public record, I'd felt something shift inside me. This was real. This was happening. There was no going back now. I'd sat at the small desk in the guest house, watching my phone as notifications started flooding in. The article was being shared rapidly across social media, picked up by local news aggregators, then regional outlets. By 8:30, the Boston Globe had published their own piece citing Lisa's investigation and adding commentary from legal experts about the potential criminal implications. The local NBC affiliate had posted a breaking news alert. My phone started ringing with unfamiliar numbers, probably reporters seeking comment, but I'd silenced it and focused on the task ahead. The digital wildfire was spreading exactly as we'd planned, but my parents likely hadn't seen it yet. Richard would be in his study reading the Wall Street Journal over coffee, his routine unchanged for decades. Victoria would be planning her day, probably reviewing details for the upcoming gala, completely unaware that event would never happen. At 8:45, I called the main house. Carmen had answered, her voice carrying its usual professional courtesy, and I'd asked to speak with my mother. There'd been a brief pause before Victoria's voice came on the line, clipped and efficient as always. "Emma, what is it?" she'd said. Not good morning or how are you feeling, just the expectation that I was calling with some need or request. I kept my voice steady and neutral. "I need to meet with you and Dad this morning. It's important. Family business." Victoria had sighed. That particular sound she made when inconvenienced. Your father has calls scheduled, and I have committee meetings. Can this wait until Sunday dinner? I'd been firm in my response. No, it can't wait. 10 o'clock in the formal sitting room. Please make sure Mason is available as well. This concerns all of you. Something in my tone must have penetrated because Victoria had agreed, albeit reluctantly, saying she'd rearrange her morning and contact Mason. The hour between that call and 10 o'clock had stretched impossibly long. I'd showered and rechecked my appearance, making sure I looked composed and strong. Jake had called to check on me, and I'd told him the meeting was set, that everything was proceeding according to plan. He'd wanted to be nearby, waiting somewhere he could reach me quickly if needed, and I'd given him the address of a coffee shop 3 blocks away. Lisa had texted updates on the article's spread, each message documenting another media outlet picking up the story. Another wave of social media reaction. By 9:30, the Attorney General's office had issued a statement confirming they were reviewing allegations of charitable fraud related to the Clarke Foundation and would be launching a formal investigation. The machinery of accountability was in motion, unstoppable now. I'd walked from the guest house to the main residence at 9:55, taking my time despite not needing the cane anymore. The brick pathway through Victoria's garden felt different somehow, like I was seeing it clearly for the first time without the filter of childhood familiarity or adult obligation. This had never really been home. It had been a stage where I'd played the role of inadequate daughter, where I'd absorbed years of subtle dismissal and outright neglect, where I'd learned that my value was conditional on meeting impossible standards. But today, I was walking this path as someone who'd refused to accept their narrative, who'd built my own case and gathered my own evidence and prepared my own reckoning. The weight of that knowledge had made me stand straighter. Carmen had opened the door before I could knock, her expression troubled in a way I'd never seen. Miss Emma, she'd said quietly, I need to tell you something. Your parents, they just found out about the news article. Mr. Clarke is on the phone with lawyers. Mrs. Clarke is, she'd paused, searching for words, very upset. I'd thanked her and stepped inside. Hearing raised voices coming from my father's study, Richard was shouting, his carefully maintained composure completely shattered, and I could hear the sharp edge of panic in his tone. Victoria's voice cut through, equally agitated, demanding to know how this happened and who was responsible. I'd stood in the foyer listening to them scramble, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. They knew. They'd seen the article, probably been inundated with calls from board members and social contacts, and now they were experiencing the first waves of consequences. Mason had arrived moments later, striding through the front door with his phone pressed to his ear, his face pale beneath his professional tan. He'd ended his call abruptly when he saw me, and for the first time in our adult lives, my brother looked actually uncertain. Emma, what the hell is going on? He'd demanded. My firm has been getting calls all morning about the foundation. There's an article saying Mom and Dad committed fraud, that they asked paramedics to let you die. Tell me this is some kind of mistake. I'd met his eyes without flinching. It's not a mistake. Every word is true, and you're about to hear exactly how I know. Mason had stared at me like I'd become a stranger, which in a way I suppose I had. I wasn't the quiet little sister he could ignore anymore. Richard had emerged from his study, his face flushed with fury, Victoria close behind him looking more furious than frightened. They'd both stopped short when they saw me standing in the foyer with Mason, and something had flickered across my mother's face. A moment of calculation where she was clearly trying to assess how much I knew and how much damage I could cause. My father had recovered first, switching into the authoritative mode he used to intimidate and control. Emma, we need to discuss this situation immediately, he'd said, gesturing toward the formal sitting room. There are serious allegations being made, lies that could destroy this family, and we need to present a united front. I'd smiled then, an expression that held no warmth whatsoever. Oh, we're definitely going to discuss this. And you're absolutely right that it will destroy this family. But there's nothing united about what's coming. We'd moved into the sitting room, the same space where I'd attended countless uncomfortable family gatherings, where Victoria had hosted her garden club and book club, where the Clarkes had performed their version of domestic harmony for visitors. The morning light slanted through tall windows, illuminating the expensive furniture and carefully curated art, all the material symbols of their success and status. We'd arranged ourselves like opponents preparing for battle. Richard and Victoria on one sofa, Mason in an armchair, me standing by the fireplace where I could see all of them. The positioning felt significant, me literally standing above them. For once, no longer diminished by their physical or psychological dominance. Richard had started to speak, probably planning to take control of the conversation, but I'd cut him off with a raised hand. You're going to listen now. For once in my entire life, you're going to actually listen to what I have to say. Victoria had opened her mouth to object, but something in my expression had stopped her. I'd pulled out my phone and set it on the mantel, the recorded audio from my father's study conversation cued and ready. Then I'd begun speaking, my voice steady and clear despite the emotion churning beneath the surface. 3 months ago, I was hit by a car in a crosswalk. I was badly injured, possibly dying, and the paramedics worked to save my life. You both arrived at the scene, and instead of showing concern or fear or any normal parental response, you asked those paramedics if there was any chance I wouldn't make it. You discussed withholding treatment. You suggested that my quality of life might not justify the effort of saving me, and then you left before I was even loaded into the ambulance. You went back to your evening plans and didn't bother coming to the hospital that night to see if your daughter would survive. The silence that followed had been absolute. Mason had gone completely white, his eyes wide with shock. Richard's face had hardened into a mask of defensive anger. Victoria had maintained her composure better, but I'd seen the slight tremor in her hands. I'd continued, my voice gaining strength. I heard everything you said that night. I was conscious enough to understand that my own parents were hoping I would die, because my survival would be inconvenient. Because a dead daughter is a tragedy you could manage, but a living one who needed your time and attention during your busy social season was unacceptable. The paramedic who treated me documented your entire conversation. My doctor at Mass General documented her concerns about your response. I have statements from multiple medical professionals who witnessed your behavior during my hospitalization. All of that is now public record, part of an investigation that will examine not just what you said that night, but everything you've built your reputation on. Richard had finally found his voice cold and cutting. This is absurd. You were traumatized, probably on medications that affected your perception. You're misinterpreting a stressful situation, and now you've created a scandal that will hurt everyone in this family. I'd press play on the audio recording in response, letting my father's own voice fill the room discussing how to route my medical expenses through the foundation to offset his personal costs. The color had drained from his face as he'd heard himself planning to defraud the charity he claimed to run with such integrity. Victoria had stood abruptly, her composure cracking. You recorded a private conversation. That's illegal. You can't use that. I'd shaken my head. Massachusetts is a one-party consent state for recordings. I was present, which makes it completely legal. And it's already been provided to the Attorney General's office, along with 3 years of foundation financial records that show systematic misuse of charitable funds. Mason had been silent through this exchange, but now he'd spoken, his lawyer brain apparently trying to find a way out. Emma, even if Mom and Dad made mistakes with the foundation, even if they said things at your accident that sound bad out of context, this doesn't have to destroy everything. We can negotiate, settle things quietly, maybe have you issue a statement saying there was a misunderstanding. I'd looked at my brother. This man who'd benefited from our parents' favoritism his entire life, who'd never questioned their treatment of me because it didn't affect him directly, who was even now more concerned with protecting the family image than acknowledging what they'd done. There's no negotiation, Mason. Your firm's billing records for foundation work are part of the investigation. You've been charging premium rates for routine corporate maintenance, probably without even reviewing what expenses you were approving. You're complicit in this, whether you knew it or not. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.